Alexander Schwab. Alexander Schwab, 5 July 1887, 12 November 1943, was a German political activist. He withdrew from active participation in politics after resigning from the fractious and short-lived Communist Workers' Party Kommunistische Arbeiter-Partei Deutschlands /KAPD in 1922, but continued his contribution as an independent left-of-center commentator-journalist. During the 12 Nazi years, he was arrested at least twice, spending the final years of his life, between 1936 and 1943, in a succession of jails. Sources may also identify him by the pseudonym under which some of his contributions were published, as Albert Sigrist Sachs. Life, provenance and early years. Young intellectual. For a year following the award of his doctorate, during 1913/14, Schwab taught at the Freie Schulgemeinde Wickersdorf, a progressive school that had been founded by the controversial education pioneer Gustav Wyneken in the countryside south of Erfurt in 1906. Several historians describe Schwab during this period as one of the leading intellects of the influential Free German youth movement. In October 1913, he participated in the first ever Free German Youth Day in the Hoher-Meißner Hills north of Frankfurt. In the months before the war, he also involved himself in conceptualizing and organizing democratically elected general student committees Allgemeiner Studentenausschuss. Around this time, Schwab and some of his intellectual friends rented a large house in Jena and embarked on what was seen at the time as a remarkable experiment in cohabitation, whereby 4 unmarried young men and 4 unmarried young women all lived together in the one house. On 8 May 1914, the unmarried status of 2 members of the cohabiting community ended when Alexander Schwab married Dr. Hildegard Fellisch. It was her 25th birthday. War and political idealism. At the end of July 1914, war broke out. Alexander Schwab lost little time in volunteering for the army. He was very quickly rejected for military service, however, on account of a pulmonary hemorrhage Lungenblutsturs. He was instead sent to a desk job in the War Supplies Department. Later, he found himself working in Dresden at the Jasmatzi cigarette factory. Despite having volunteered for military service in 1914, by 1918 Alexander Schwab had joined the anti-war movement. He became friendly with the radical socialist educationalist Otto Rühl 1874–1943 and with the young artist Konrad Felix Müller. In 1917, Schwab joined the Independent Social Democratic Party Unabhängige Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands /Ost, which had broken away from the mainstream Social Democratic Party SOSI. The next year, he joined the Spartacus League. He was numbered among the close friends of the movement's best-known founders, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Communist Workers' Party of Germany. At the end of the year, the Communist Party of Germany emerged from the Ost, founded formally at a 3-day conference in Berlin between 30 December 1918 and 1 January 1919. Schwab found himself on the left wing of the Communist Party, collaborating closely with Karl Schroeder 1884–1950. Beyond the world of party politics, directly following the revolutions of 1918–19, he teamed up with the teacher Frieda Winkelmann 1873–1943 and others to set up a free academy community for proletarians, Freie Hochschulgemeinde for Proletarier, from which emerged, in the first part of 1919, the Soviet. Barely 2 years later, the institution became insolvent and was taken over by the trades unions. The parties of the left were prone to fragment during this period, and in 1920 Alexander Schwab and his friend Karl Schroeder were founder members of the Communist Workers' Party Kommunistische Arbeiter-Partei Deutschlands /KAPD, becoming a leading ideological strategist of its Berlin group. In June/July 1921, he led the KAPD delegation to the Third World Congress of the Communist International Comintern, held in Moscow. He was sharply critical of Comrade Lenin's political tactics in respect of Western Europe. The speeches he contributed were published in the Congress minutes, using the cover name Sachs to identify him. Progressive journalist, regime change, dismissal, and arrests. The Nazis took power in January 1933 and lost very little time in transforming Germany into a one-party dictatorship. Schwab was dismissed from his job as a press spokesman under the provisions of the Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service Gesetz zur Wiederherstellung des Berufsbeamtentums enacted in April 1933. The law is frequently cited as an anti-Semitic device, which it was, but it was also directed at eliminating political opposition from the public services, and Schwab's very public political record would have been repugnant to the Nazis. That same month he was taken into protective custody by the Gestapo on account of suspected anti-state activities wegen des Verdachts staatsfeindlicher Umtriebe. Sources vary as to the duration of this initial period of detention, which seems to have lasted for approximately 2 or 6 months. One source indicates that his relatively early release resulted from the personal intervention of his father-in-law, Dr. Paul Fellisch, with Magnus von Levitzow, the Berlin police commissioner. As a former senior naval official Admiralitätsrat, Paul Fellisch was at this stage still not without influence within establishment circles. Even before 1933, Schwab had teamed up with old comrades from their KAPD days to form the secretive Rotkämpfer Red Fighters Operation, an apparently broadly based association drawing members from various groups on the political left, intended to prepare for underground opposition in the event of a Nazi takeover. By its nature, details of the organization are in short supply, but others involved in setting it up included Karl Schroeder, Arthur Goldstein, and Bernhard Reichenbach. Schwab had been seriously considering emigration to Mexico. However, shortly after his release his wife Hildegard died, which some sources implicitly connect with his new determination to stay in Germany and engage in illegal political activity in opposition to the government. He joined with Franz Jung to launch Wirtschaftskorrespondenz, a press agency with its focus on business news. It evidently filled a genuine niche in the market for this type of service, at one stage supplying regular economic news items to more than 50 newspapers, including Volkischer Beobachter, the mass circulation daily newspaper of the ruling Nazi Party. The agency provided him with an income. In the words of one source, Schwab and Jung also used the agency as a cover for unspecified underground political activity. Arrest, interrogation, and trial. It is not entirely clear when Alexander Schwab took over the national leadership of the shadowy Rotkämpfer Red Fighters. On at least one occasion, early in 1936, he crossed the border to Prague in order to arrange the production of a Rotkämpfer news sheet. While in Prague, he received warnings not to return to Germany. He nevertheless returned to Berlin and, if he had not done so already, became the Rotkämpfer national leader. In the context of a wider roundup of the organization's leadership, Alexander Schwab's office was surrounded by Nazi paramilitaries on 17 November 1936, and he was arrested. In the interrogations that followed, he was badly tortured. At the session that took place on 21 November 1936, he was keen to take full responsibility for the Rotkämpfer on his own shoulders. He was, in particularly, determined to minimize the culpability attaching to Karl Schroeder, Franz Jung, and, in particular, the younger members of the leadership team. It is one mark of his success that both Schroeder and Jung survived long enough to outlive the Nazi regime. Jung, indeed, was released almost at once and able to escape via Prague to Budapest. After about a year of investigative detention, 6 members of the Rotkämpfer leadership, identified in the record as Schwab and comrades Schwab und Genossen, faced trial before the Second Senate of the Special People's Court in Berlin on 28, 29, and 30 October 1937. One of the defendants, Karl Schroeder, later shared some memories of the trial. The 3 judges did not appear to have backgrounds in the justice system. The third of them was a teacher who attempted to calculate a sentence for one of the defendants. He appeared unaware of the requirement to take account of pretrial detention already served, but then wanted to reduce the sentence because the man to be sentenced had done some teaching which sounded to him like a mitigating factor. When it was Schroeder's own turn to testify, he found himself talking about a public meeting at which he had talked about generational issues, generations fridge. His testimony had to be paused while a colleague explained to the leading judge, he means, sort of, between young and older mate, so's wischen jung und alt. The three judges were evidently unable to get their heads around the fact that despite the defendants obviously being communists, they were also self-evidently fervently anti-Bolshevik. According to Schroeder's not necessarily completely unbiased memories, he himself had so impressed the court that they came close to releasing him without further ado on the grounds that he was evidently not entirely of sound mind, nicht ganz ordnungsfähig. In the end, Schroeder received a 4-year prison term. His health was ruined, but he nevertheless lived on till 1950. Of the 6 men facing the court, it was Alexander Schwab who received the longest sentence, which seems to have reflected his continuing determination to absorb as far as possible the culpability that might otherwise attach to comrades. The court sentenced him to an 8-year jail term, being particularly concerned that he had been writing for German newspapers while simultaneously working against the German state. Alexander Schwab was the only one of the 6 who would not survive his prison term. Prison and death. During the ensuing years, Schwab was held in prisons at Brandenburg, Zwickau, and Sonnenberg. He also spent time in the concentration camp at Borgermoor. At times he was subjected to severe physical abuses. It was at Zwickau that he died. The circumstances and cause of his death were never entirely clear. The prison authorities reported that he died of pneumonia. References